Welcome to a special crossover episode of both DC Productions and Final Fantasy Weekly. I am your host, Drew Kreisman, and today I'm diving into Triangle Strategy, a game in which I absolutely loved, but I also have a whole lot of thoughts about, and have to get into a few unfortunately baffling decisions that, for me, stopped this game from being an absolute masterpiece and one of my favorites of all time. It still may end up being one of my more favorite games of all time, and I'll get to that at the end. But there's a lot to discuss here. So, like I said, I am going to make this episode free on both of my patron accounts. For those of you who don't know, I've got, we do the Final Fantasy Weekly. It's just $1 a month. We've done Final Fantasies 1 through 7, plus Tactics, Chrono Trigger, bunch of Studio Ghibli movies, a handful of random topics. We've got a few interviews on there, all for just $1 a month. And then on DC Productions, there are a couple of tiers. It starts at $1 a month. Most of the stuff is available there. We've been running through the Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power. It's where I've also got all the Star Wars, MCU, DCEU talk, random TV shows that I just want to talk about and recommend to people. So at a grand total of $2 a month, you can support both channels, and I would really, really appreciate it. All right, let's get into talking about Triangle Strategy. Now, like I said up front, my biggest takeaway is that I absolutely loved this game, but I am going to begin with the critiques, because I want to end on a positive note, and also because I want to start, I think, with some of the things I've heard from people when I've tweeted about this game and seen in reviews that are likely to be the biggest hurdles to getting into the experience. And I have to begin with the pacing. Triangle Strategy is unfortunately a very poorly paced video game. Now, it's not a poorly paced story, so if you are okay with going into a game and sometimes having legitimately 45 minutes between battles, between combat gameplay, and I'm going to talk a little later about the more nuanced types of gameplay that there are, but there's a lot of story, there's a lot of dialogue, there's a lot of setup and explanation. And now I just finished, a lot of you know, Yakuza 7, right? I've been on this JRPG run for a good long time now, and this is a trope of the genre. It's very common, especially in early game, to do a lot of setup. Yakuza absolutely has this problem. Persona absolutely had this problem, and is one of the reasons why I dropped it. For now, at least, right? So I totally understand anyone saying, look, man, I booted up Triangle Strategy thinking I was going to play some tactical RPG combat, ready to get into this Final Fantasy Tactics Ogre type of thing. There's one brief fight, then there's like 40 minutes of story before we get to the next one. And that happens a couple of times. What's strange to me about this is that essentially the story is streamlined in such a way that you really do feel like there's no extra. There's nothing that you would cut out of the main story. So on the one hand, like I said, it's a poorly paced video game. If you are just sitting down to watch it as a movie or a television show or a story, it moves at a pretty solid clip, and I think does its job as well as it can, though there's some nuances I got to talk about later with the story in general. But what's weird is that there are like no skirmishes on the way. There were several times throughout the game where I thought, surely there will be a battle. We're traveling from here to there. Bandits will accost us on the road, or, whatever. And there was like none of that, which was weird to me because it seemed a ton of missed opportunities. And there were even some times in the story where I thought, okay, surely it's been a little while since we've had a battle. We're having a conflict here. And then there wouldn't be a fight. And I was like, man, you very easily could have just put in a lot more battles throughout the game that were smaller. Because what's interesting is once you do get to a battle, they take a very long time as well. And I found myself oftentimes replaying them because sometimes there are interesting, like it's not just always, kill the enemy leader or kill all the enemy combatants. There's certain things I don't want to give away too much away, but do that without letting certain bad things happen on the battlefield or whatever. So it's really interesting to replay lots of the fights, and the combat system itself, which I'll talk about later, is fantastic. But what they did was put a bunch of optional fights kind of in your menu, in your screen, so that what I realized about halfway through my first playthrough of the game before getting into New Game Plus was I could have been breaking up the story with more fights, but I had to like go into a menu and choose like an optional skirmish to do it. And I really feel like the pacing of the entire game would have felt 1,000 times better, and they probably wouldn't have lost a lot of people in the first half hour, 2 hours of the game, as they probably did, as I heard on Twitter, if they would have just built some of these into the story. Even if they had to make up ridiculous excuses to have random skirmishes, I just feel like leaving the pacing up to the player. And now that I'm going back on New Game Plus, I'm basically doing a story scene, an optional battle, a story scene, an optional battle, and then a story scene that leads to a real battle, right? A story-based battle. But man, that I think was a big swing and a miss. And it's unfortunate because there's a great story here, but I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. Another big criticism that I had, and speaking of there being a ton of dialogue, is that the voice acting, and more specifically the voice direction, is really strange. It sounds to me like they had limited studio time and got a bunch of talented actors to do these roles, but maybe gave them a day to read all of the lines. Because what happens is there will be moments, I feel like almost every character, and there are a ton of characters. There's a huge cast, much like Game of Thrones, Final Fantasy Tactics, that kind of thing. And the cast is great, and I love the characters, and I think they're very well developed. But some of the most challenging scenes, like if somebody's getting emotional, or actually there's a really great scene early on where a character is just drunk out of his mind, they're really, really good. But there are a lot of lines of dialogue that just feel like, did somebody hand that to you with no context and say, just read the words on this page? Because they lack any inflection whatsoever. It's really bizarre to me. I feel like there are a handful of times where it sounds like early video game voice acting or late 90s video game voice acting, where like some of it's okay. A lot of it sounds almost like the way you might do a character if you were a parent reading a story to a child and you're kind of doing a voice, but there's not a ton of inflection because you're not an actor. It almost feels like they told the actors to hold back in most of the scenes, but every once in a while they get to deliver like something amazing. And so it kind of blows my mind. One of the things that I think added to the disconnect is that there are, I'm going to say something incorrect, but I'm going to follow it up. There are no accents. Now, everybody has an accent, technically. I have an accent, the middle America, white guy that they put on the evening news to make it sound like there's no accent. That is still an accent, right? And that is the accent that almost everybody in the game has. And I found that remarkably strange for a number of reasons. One, it didn't allow for, differentiating too much between character voices. Though by the end of the game, I felt like they all had their own strong personalities. But the script is very much written in such a way that suggests accents, right? So first of all, it's written in that kind of old English style. It's not quite at the level of Final Fantasy Tactics, but, War of the Lions. But I would say it's like the next level down. The script is very good. There are moments where it feels forced and off, like you'll get a random like doth or shan't that you're just like trying a little too hard there, and didn't quite get it right. But again, when you're using that type of language, and not only that, there will be some characters that clearly are meant to speak in more of like a Scottish type of dialect. It's the way they're written with like, ye, like yeah, ye, and oh yeah, you like if you were reading that, or maybe it's more of a Cockney accent or whatever. Again, in almost any other story, that's what it would be. But instead, like it's really bizarre to hear a character say in like middle American accent, "There's a tourney on the morrow." Right? There's something about that as opposed to there's a tourney on the morrow. There's something about that I felt I had a hard time getting over throughout much of the game. But I won't say that the voice acting was like so grating. It was it ruined the experience for me by any means. Like I said, I still actually ended up having a very deep attachment to almost all of the characters. But that for me was one of these big weird disconnects of like, what was the voice direction here, or why were it just sounds like they didn't have enough studio time to give every line some attention. It really did sound like some of the lines of dialogue were read in one take and they just didn't feel like they had time to redo it. And it is unfortunate because it robs some scenes, and I feel like it's especially bad early on. And so I got like a bad first impression of a lot of characters who I did end up coming to care about. But some of them I was like, what is going on with this voice? Like, there's just nothing happening here, right? And I was like, that's really bizarre. Okay. Let's start getting into the really, really good stuff. Though an interesting transition here will be into some of the aesthetics, because the music, I feel like, is another good example of where this game like almost was a masterpiece, but then a couple of baffling decisions just held it back. The music itself is wonderful. Almost all of the pieces of music that are present in the game, I think on their own are quality, and I would listen to them, you know, just sitting and doing my work or whatever, right? But there's a limited number of tracks. I couldn't tell you exactly how many. In my mind, there's somewhere between 10 to 14 that just kind of play over and over and over again. Now, I didn't really get sick of them in terms of, man, I've heard this track too much. But what happened was there were individual scenes where it felt like they just had to grab one of the pieces of available music and it's accompanying a scene where it didn't feel like it fit, right? So it's like, it's not that the music is bad, but it's counter to the tone of the scene, and it felt like this is a scene or a character moment that could use its own unique piece of music. And they just, again, it didn't have the budget to do that, or whatever, and so they just used what they had. And it was another way in which I felt like, unfortunately, this story that really could have been mind-blowingly incredible was held back by some tonal things where I found myself skipping quickly through some of the scenes because the music didn't quite fit and the voice acting was a little bit weird. And while what was happening was really interesting, it was just tonally a little bit bizarre. That said, the music is fantastic, and there was something I really loved, especially further you get into the game, some of the battle music, and something that it does where it shifts the battle music, like it will change in the middle of a fight depending on some things that have happened, and that was really, really cool, and something that made me think, oh, I wish Final Fantasy Tactics had done that. So that was a really neat thing. All right, let's get into some of the stuff where I've got very few critiques and tell you, so why do I still love this game so much? Oh no, wait, I got a few more critiques. I skipped over the writing a little bit. A couple other things that I wanted to talk about. The names, right? The game is called Triangle Strategy, and I do not know why. I don't know what Square Enix is doing lately with Triangle Strategy, Octopath Traveler, like this shape. I don't know what that is. I don't know what Triangle Strategy is supposed to evoke as a title, but in me, it evokes almost nothing. I was interested in the game because for a very long time I've been looking for a spiritual successor to Final Fantasy Tactics. And to some extent, we get that here. But why the weird name? And this happens actually throughout the game. There are several characters. Like there's a prince whose name is Frani. And I thought, okay, that's going to be Franny or something. And it's Franny. You know, it's like, and it seemed like they were picking names out of the hat. Some of them are very like basic. There's like a Benedict, but then there's also a Julio, and the main character is Sarah Noah. And I just like, I don't know, maybe there's a naming convention that I'm just not seeing, but it felt like they were all over the map with really no rhyme or reason. Most of the characters don't have last names, but some of them do. You know, there was just a lot of weirdness going on with the naming of things, beginning with the naming of the game. I've been trying to come up with a few on my own. You could have called it the Salt Iron Wars, right? You could have called it the Salt Iron Tactics, I think would have been an interesting title for it. But actually, I think the best name for the game, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, would have been Scales of Conviction. It's It's an important artifact in the game. It's an important gameplay mechanic. It sounds like a title, and there's a certain kind of regalness to it, scales of conviction. And I do think that's more what the game is about, even more than the tactical combat. And so, anyway, I think all of those they're from the text of the game. They're what the game is about, and they're far better than Triangle Strategy. So I don't know. They just needed an editor in the room for some of these things. The script has the JRPG problem of over-explaining, which is good for a super complicated story, but it's just so clear that they don't want you to get left behind or feel like you don't know what's going on, because there's a lot going on, and so they do a lot of explaining, but you probably could have cut 10% of the dialogue out of the script and dedicated that time to putting in more skirmishes and battles and gameplay rather than re-explaining stuff that we already know and understand. But other than that, like I said, the writing is fantastic. The lore is excellent. There are things like people riding giant hawks that are never really explained. Honestly, for a game that's a lot about salt and taxes and, the taxation of trade routes to outlying star systems, essentially, if you're in, and that's one of the things I want to say is, this game, I think, requires a certain kind of person to appreciate it, and I want anyone who would appreciate it to play it, because it's got such a phenomenal, nuanced story about people and resources and humanity and different types of governments and different ways of life and different ways of thinking that are all really, really intriguing. I'm going to get back to that at the end, but in terms of the writing doing the job it needs to do the most, and dealing with things like worker compensation, resource distribution, how do we treat each other, how do we make decisions, it's a phenomenal script and story. And then they named it Triangle Strategy and put Prince Franny in it. It's so bizarre. I'm like, I wish I could have just edited this. I could never have made something this brilliant, but I feel like I could have edited this game into a masterpiece. Okay, here's an area where I have no notes, no problems, no issues, maybe a couple of addendums, but certainly no negative critiques, and that is the graphics and the art. The only thing I guess I could say is, it looks like a hyped up, old PS1 game. It's got that, isometric, pixelated. It does have more of the Octopath travel. Like, you can, the ability to swing the camera around and view the maps from every single angle, it felt like magic to me. That was one of the things I hate about playing Final Fantasy Tactics every time I go back to it, is how sometimes you just can't see stuff at the right angle. You've got like 4 camera angles for everything. And this was, you could really move the thing around, zoom in and out. The artwork is gorgeous. The colors are beautiful. Like, the colors of this game are geniusly employed and really, really good. The character portraits are beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, and the characters are all interestingly designed, even if not all of them are interestingly named. Most of them look like you could put them right into a Final Fantasy, particularly into an Ivalice type of world, but a lot of them have a lot more color, right? Ivalice can be pretty brown and gray at times. This game just pops, man. It's beautiful. And I think they do a pretty good job of avoiding certain character design tropes. One or two, like, honestly, the 2 main male characters are probably the 2 most boringly designed. Everybody else has really interesting design elements, to the extent that I fell in love with the primary female lead, my betrothed, from the very beginning, very, very quickly. I love her. She's one of my favorite, Frederica, one of my favorite characters in the game. One thing, again, if I'm going to add an addendum to the graphics and art section, I would love to have seen a couple of short cutscenes. And that's maybe asking too much for a game that didn't have enough time to pay the voice actors for more than a day of work or do more than like 12 pieces of music. God, this game needs a sequel to iron these things out and get them done, because, and on this cutscene thing, not a ton. Similar to how Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions has just a couple of cutscenes, a little hand-drawn moment. We've already got the voice actors, pay them an extra day. But there's a hint of, in the hand-drawn art for a lot of the places, a couple individual scenes. There's like books you can look through where there are scenes from the past or whatever. The characters, I just would have loved, just give me an intro and an outro. I don't even need cutscenes throughout the game. Just a little something in that art style. Again, it's hard to critique that because it's like, why didn't you make an animated movie in addition to this game? But I would have loved to see that. But the game is gorgeous. If you're into this style of art, as long as you're just not totally repulsed by pixels, it's absolutely, absolutely gorgeous. All right, I want to talk about a couple of gameplay things before I finish up on the politics and morality. So, I love the tactical combat system of this game, and I think that when you're in combat, it is as satisfying and in-depth and engaging as any tactical RPG that I've ever played. The Tactics Advance, back when I was really into Shining Force. Now, I haven't played a Fire Emblem in a couple of generations. I don't own a Switch. So I'm behind on Fire Emblem. So if there are things that I'm sure there are things that game is doing even better than this, and I don't want to give all the credit to Triangle Strategy, but there's so much that can be done inside the battles to fight them differently, to even, like I said, some of the different just goals in the battles. I absolutely loved the combat system, where I think a lot of people, and again, I saw this on Twitter, are going to fall down a little bit on maybe their hopes and expectations coming into the game, is that there isn't really a robust character growth system. There isn't a job system. There isn't a ton of character customization. Now, they do all, you can promote their class a little bit and you can better their weapons, but it's pretty linear and straightforward character progression. Basically, every character that you will come across is locked into a job, and I don't mind that because I ultimately felt like they gave me all the jobs and abilities that I probably would have wanted to customize anyway. But if you do, and I've talked about this on the Final Fantasy Weekly show, I love playing around in the menus of Final Fantasy Tactics. And there's really not much of that here. It's just very straightforward. Do you have the resources? Okay, then yeah, you can upgrade. Do you not? Well, then you can't. And, there wasn't a few choices throughout. There are some. In fact, there are a couple of either or, like you can decide that this will make this spell better or this spell better. So you can do a little bit of that, but there's certainly no taking your main character and turning him into a mage. No, he's the primary sword wielder, and he will remain the primary sword wielder throughout. Like I said, the most of them are locked into their jobs. I do think there's a good variety of characters. In fact, in my second playthrough on New Game Plus, I'm discovering new characters who I didn't meet the first time around, one of whom is becoming like one of my favorites, which I think is really, really cool and interesting. But yeah, it's fascinating that they didn't do that part of the game really at all, like the job system or the customization, and focused it all in on balancing these battles and giving you a lot of different ways. So rather than changing classes, if you want a different tactic in any given battle, you're just going to change out characters, right? Oh, I need this character, I need that character for what they can do, which felt a little bit more like classic Shining Force to me, which I really appreciated in that regard. But the other thing that's really interesting about Triangle Strategy is gameplay is not limited to combat. And I did not realize going in that really the most fun that I was going to have, as much as I enjoyed the tactical combat, are these little sequences where essentially the way it works, I got to do a little story setup for you here. This is going to be minor spoilers for the very beginning of the game. But House Wolfort, that's us, right? The main guy, Serenora Wolfort, that is us. We have this sort of close group of 7 companions, and they each get a vote in our little proto-democracy, how we decide to make decisions throughout the game. And the mechanic works basically like this. Whenever a big decision comes up, you as Serenoa get a little bit where you walk around and explore a castle, a town, whatever. And you talk to as many people as you can, including your companions. And you gather information about the decision at hand. And then first you, like literally in the real world, have to decide which of these things do you want to do. And there are some tricky ones. It's basically the trolley problem game. That's another game. That would have been better than Triangle Strategy. It's been Trolley Problem, the game. But so they can be very difficult decisions, right? So you need to gather as much information as you can. And that can be interesting. Just walking around town, seeing if you can find out extra information, putting the pieces together, talking to different people, finding useful items based on what you've been told. And it even unlocks like further dialogue options in the dialogue trees that will come up later. And so you have all of these back and forths with people that determine what kind of leader you are. And there's a hidden system the first time around. Once you get to New Game Plus, you can see the system. And it'll determine certain storyline options and outcomes. And then you get to this moment where you have to try to convince each of your 7 companions to do one thing or the other. Sometimes there are 3 different decisions in front of you, right? And everyone's got their own motivations. And this is what's so great about the writing and the characterization. It's all so believable that that character would want to do this thing and that character would want to do this thing. And for every one of them, you have to consider not just what you think is the best argument, but what you think is the best argument for the person you're talking to. And the better you understand them, the more likely you are to sway them to one side or the other. So you have your opportunity to sway each of your 7 companions, and then they vote. And then you do whatever is voted upon. Twice in my first playthrough, I tried very hard to convince my team to do one thing, and they voted against me. The first time, I reset my save because I just could not live with their decision. It was classic trolley problem. Do you give up your friend to stop the battle? You all know me. My answer, no. And then they voted, we're giving up the friend. And I went, no, I don't want the story this early on to go in this direction. And I stopped my save. And I redid it, and I convinced everybody. I used different arguments, and I convinced everybody we did what I wanted to, and I felt very good about it. The second time I was overruled, I just went with it because I was curious to see where it went, and I wasn't so morally horrified by the other decision that I just went, okay, let's see how this pans out, and I ended up finishing out the game that way. You can get endings. There was one time where I bit in so hard on not compromising my morals that we just got surrounded and destroyed. I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's one of the ends of the game. You die here and history forgets you. Fair enough. I honestly didn't feel that terrible about it. I was like, I stand by my decisions, right? I got to one ending that I was very pleased with, by the way. And I've heard it's not the, quote, good or perfect or best, but I'm not even sure there is necessarily a best ending, though. I am curious upon my New Game Plus to go back and do it. But my New Game Plus is so much more about revisiting these conversations, repoliticking, seeing if I can figure out a way to get all the powers that be that do the right thing and figure out an outcome that, as much as I was happy with my first ending, I could absolutely see there being a better outcome for all involved. And so I'm very curious to see if I can force that upon a second playthrough. And I also have to say, this is maybe the first time I've ever played a game where I wasn't even halfway through and I knew I was going to start it over immediately upon playing it, because these decisions matter. More than any other game I've played, maybe since Mass Effect 2 or whatever. And even then, I feel like those games have this sort of like easy morality to track. There's almost always the good decision and the bad decision, and then maybe once in a while you'll get a decision that just totally breaks your heart. But the decisions in Triangle Strategy dramatically change the story almost every time you make one. And I couldn't help but wonder, even though most of the time, I would say about half the time, I felt like steadfast. Yes, I'm making the right decision. Like I said, I wasn't going to give up my friend for the battle, to stop the battle. On the other hand, there were 2 or 3 times where I did not know. I had to go around and talk to everybody because I didn't know what the best thing to do was. I really didn't. And, even as I was making this decision, I was like, I wonder if we could have done better had we gone the other way. And now, upon New Game Plus, you can do that and learn more about it. But for me, it's the most successful a game has ever been at making your decisions feel like they matter and that they are impacting the story. And almost to the extent that it's hard to imagine how it would have gone if you had made a different decision. And I'm wondering, like, on my second playthrough, are there going to be characters who died the first time around who stay alive? Will I be able to figure out a way to save them? Can I stop this initial conflict from even happening in the first place because of a different decision I made the first time? Like, it's absolutely brilliant. It's genius, which is why I wish so much that all these other parts of the game were better, because I can see people jumping out at the bad pacing or at the weird voice acting or at some of the clunky lines of dialogue, or even at the fact that it's kind of old school in terms of its graphics. But at the heart of this game is an incredibly deep and like self-made. It's not that it's self-made, it's like a choose-your-own adventure novel, right? But when you say that, like, most choose-your-own adventure stories aren't that great. I don't know. Maybe correct me about that in the Discord or in the comments here if you're like, actually, some of them are phenomenal. Here are some links. But I tend to think of them as being mostly pretty silly. But it's absolutely incredible. I mean, the politics, the morality, the ethics of it, and it gets you to question your own ethics, right? And again, it's not as simple as like give up your friend to stop the battles very early on, and that's, trolley problem 101. But it's not always, as easy as that. Sometimes, what sacrifices do you make of yourself to fight for? There's so much going on in this story. There's an oppressed racial group. Now, one thing I will say, and I've pointed this out about a lot of the Square Enix stuff lately, this game is very, very white. There are a handful of characters of color, and nothing is really made of it. I certainly could have done for quite a few more, especially in a story that does deal with the concept of racism and oppression and even slavery. And it's done through people who have different hair color as opposed to different skin color. And so that's, I think, a good way of doing it. And you certainly don't want to like make the story and, okay, we've included black people and they're all slaves. Like, that's just worse, arguably, right? You don't want to do that. But it's always unfortunate when there's a lack of diversity. And it is fascinating that you do have this big part of the story that deals with racial oppression, but just kind of through a different lens. And it's very, very well handled. Certainly in my playthrough it was. And I'd love to get into that deeper sometime. But again, I don't want to spoil this because I think even most of the people in my Discord haven't played this one yet. So for anyone who's new, or for those of you who've been around before, as a reminder, I don't really give a grand total score before at the end of these reviews. And Triangle Strategy is the perfect example of why I don't. In fact, there are two of these in a row, right? Yakuza was very similar, where if I was going down each category, gameplay, especially if you're including in gameplay like character growth and that kind of customization, those types of things, it's not going to get a 10 out of 10. Sound design and music is not going to get a 10 out of 10. In fact, I don't think I would give this game a 10 out of 10 in any category other than like handling of morality and ethics, which is like not usually what we grade video games on, right? The depth of the decision making. There are moments of writing in this that I'm going to go back and find in the script and keep around and keep with me. There were moments that honestly reminded me of Andor in a way where I just jumped up and yelled, F yeah! Just yes. That is why oppression and imperialism are not okay. There is just, especially from Frederica, she drops some absolute fire for those of you who've played the game. Yes, that was an intentional pun. But she's incredible, but there is a handling of mature and difficult topics, and sometimes it's salt taxes, and sometimes it's there's a lot of stuff about faith and religion. So here's what I'm finished out on, is explaining sort of the setup for you. So if you don't want any spoilers for the story, this is just the basic setup, right? But you've got the 3 different kingdoms, one of which is entirely built around the religion, but as long as you believe in the religion, everybody is equal. There's no like hierarchy. Then you've got you've got this kind of meritocracy empire where all the people who have the best ability rise to the top, but then they don't care about anything that happens to the people down below them, right? And then we have our heroes who are from Glenbrook, which is this it's a kingdom with like proto-democracy elements built in. So they do have an established hierarchy. Our house, Wolford, operates on this kind of parliamentary system that I was describing earlier. And each one of those governing systems has their pluses and minuses that are dived into in such a compelling fashion that I couldn't stop playing it. Despite all of the issues I have, this is the fastest I've completed a video game in a while. I couldn't stop. And I think if you go in knowing that you're getting half of an interactive storybook and the other half is a tactical RPG with a playable political system in it, if you go in knowing that, this game is an absolute gem. The game itself isn't maybe a 10 out of 10, but a 9.5. Yeah, what I said was it's an A-tier Final Fantasy. Right? Now, meaning it's not an S-tier Final Fantasy. But remember how few Final Fantasy... I'm a little... it's got 5 or 6 games in that tier. Those are my 5 or 6 most favorite games of all time. Throw Kingdom Hearts 2, Metal Gear Solid 2 in there. There you've got, close to my top 10 already. This isn't going to make it into my top 10 favorite video games of all time, but it's as good as a lot of the games in my A tier of Final Fantasy games. That's like Final Fantasy 8, Final Fantasy 15, games that I absolutely love and adore. 12, 4, right? And Tactics 2, Electric Boogaloo, may as well have called it that. Triangle Strategy, a game with a bad name. That just goes to exemplify the entire thing, right? It's just, why call it that? Why not give... If this game had had 4 or 5 more months in the hopper, a few more pieces of music, a few of these bits of voice acting ironed out, some of the excess dialogue cut down, some of these battles worked into the story, this game would have been a 10 out of 10 in every category masterpiece. I mean, this would have been one of my favorite games of all time. And on some level, it still is, because it provided me with a unique experience that no other video game I've ever played has done. And you get massive points for doing that. But it's probably the most frustrated I've been while playing a game I knew I absolutely loved and adored, because I just found myself going, why? Why make that decision? Why say we're not going to do any British accents whatsoever? It's like they went out of their way to, because like they didn't want it to sound like how other things sound. But it's like, but it's written that way. Just read it how it's written. Just give us 2 or 3 snarky British characters, because everyone sounds like a snarky British character. But like, again, it was just so close to, again, being a 10 out of 10 in every single category. And instead it's probably 8s and 9s across the board. But like Yakuza 7, more than the sum of its parts, greater than the sum of its parts by a lot. So if you think you can get past the slow pacing, especially at the beginning, some of the wonky voice acting, there is a gem in here that should absolutely be experienced by anyone who thinks that they might find interesting a story that can balance the taxation of salt with faith-based governments and slave rebellions. You know what I mean? Like, if that sounds like the kind of story you want to get into, this is an experience for you. So it comes with my highest of recommendations to a certain group of people. And I hope there's a sequel, because if they iron this stuff out, then it can come as my highest recommendations to everybody. So there are my thoughts on Triangle Strategy, or as I'm going to start calling it, Scales of Conviction. Thank you all for listening in. Let me know what you thought if you've played the game, or if this review has made you think, yeah, I might give that a try. I'd love to hear your thoughts as you're going through it. Again, for anybody that's new, make sure that you're checking out both Patreon pages, DC Productions, where you can get all the Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and MCU and other video game stuff that do the Yakuza stuff that I was talking about. And of course, the Final Fantasy Weekly page, which is 90% Final Fantasy. We got some Studio Ghibli stuff on there as well. Always having a whole lot of fun. Thank you for listening in, and thank you for continuing to be absolutely awesome out there. I will continue to be absolutely Drew Creasman in here. And until next time, I will see you out there in the world.